As I mentioned earlier, today brings us to the last Sunday of the Divine Encounters Through the Elements sermon series. And so over the past few weeks, we've been spending some time paying attention to the ways that God meets us through the elements of creation. So we started with fire, then we went to water and air, and this Sunday is earth. And so along the way, each story has been inviting us to notice God's presence a little differently. And so today, as we come to the final story, we'll find ourselves doing something also incredibly ordinary of walking a road. So let's read Luke 24, verses 13 through 31 together. The walk to Emmaus. Now on that same day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem, and talking with each other about all these things that had happened. While they were talking and discussing, Jesus himself came near and went with them, but their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And he said to them, "What are you discussing with each other while you walk along?" They stood still, looking sad. Then one of them, whose name was Cleopas, answered him, "Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who does not know the things that have taken place there in these days?" He asked them, "What things?" They replied, "The things about Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and leaders handed him over to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Yes, and besides all this, it is now the 3rd day since these things took place. Moreover, some women of our group astounded us. They were at the tomb early this morning, and when they did not find his body there, they came back and told us that they had indeed seen a vision of angels who said that he was alive. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they did not see him." Then he said to them, "Oh, how foolish you are, and how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have declared. Was it necessary that the Messiah should suffer these things and then enter into his glory?" Then, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them the things about himself in all the scriptures. As they came near the village to which they were going, he walked on as if he were going ahead. But they urged him strongly, saying, "Stay with us, because it is almost evening, and the day is now nearly over." So he went in to stay with them. When he was at the table with them, he took bread, blessed and broke it, and gave it to them. When their eyes were open and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. I imagine that many of us have learned that there are some places and directions that your body remembers them. Have you ever been driving somewhere and a few minutes later you realized that you were headed in the completely wrong direction? And this isn't because you were lost, but it's because your body took you somewhere familiar. So maybe you meant to go to the grocery store, but a few minutes into the commute, you realize that you're halfway to your way to work because your car thought that's where you were going. It's kind of a strange feeling to realize you've been moving without really noticing where you were going. And I wonder if Cleopas and his companion in this story felt a little like that. Luke tells us that they are walking toward Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. And so we don't actually know why they're walking. We just know that this is not a quick trip around the block. That is 7 miles of earth beneath their feet. 7 miles for them to replay what has been happening over the past couple days. 7 miles to talk, to wonder, and to remember. And we know that they have a lot to remember. So just days earlier, They believed that Jesus was the one that they had been waiting for. They had spent years watching him teach. They had heard stories of healings. They have watched crowds gather around him. And they had begun imagining that maybe, just maybe, God was going to do something new. And then something earth-shattering for them happened. Jesus, the one who was supposed to save, was arrested. Jesus was crucified, and Jesus died. And now there are rumors that this tomb is empty. Some have been saying that they've been seeing angels and that Jesus is in fact alive. But these two disciples don't know what to do about this. So they walk. And somewhere along the way, Jesus joins and walks with them. They don't recognize Jesus. And so many have speculated that maybe God caused the sun to be in their eyes based on the direction they were going, or maybe their spiritual radar wasn't quite in tune to be able to recognize Jesus. But Jesus simply asks, "What are you talking about?" And they stop walking. Luke tells us that they stand still and look sad. And then Cleopas essentially says, "Have you been living under a rock?" Or maybe more eloquently, "Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who does not know the things that have taken place these days?" And so Jesus asks, "What things?" And maybe you chuckle with me because, of course, Jesus knows. Jesus knows what Jesus has done better than anyone. But Jesus asks anyway. And so these followers of Jesus tell Jesus about the story of Jesus. And eventually, all these three people, they continue walking together. And there's three words that I want to notice this morning that I think reveal kind of the trouble underneath this passage. And those are the words, "we had hoped." Notice that they don't say, "we hope." They don't say, "we still believe." Their hope has become past tense. And this is the heartbreaking reality of the disciples today and in the story of their lives. These disciples, they aren't just grieving the loss of their loved one. They are grieving the future that they thought Jesus' life made possible. The ground underneath their feet and their very lives has begun to shift. They thought they knew what God was doing with Jesus, and they thought they knew where their story was headed or what Jesus' life meant. And now they're walking away from Jerusalem, carrying memories that no longer make sense because Jesus is no longer alive. And that's a particular kind of grief, isn't it? The grief that happens when you don't just lose something or someone. The grief that happens when you lose the story that you had built around it. I think many of us know that kind of shift in our lives. There's a strange experience that can happen when you return to a familiar place, one that your body knows, but after something in your life has changed. So imagine Joanne returning to her childhood home after her parents have died. Joanne pulls into the driveway. The large tree in the front yard is still there. The sidewalk is still the same with its uneven crevices and skid marks from bikes. Joanne walks into the childhood home, instinctively knowing which sides of the steps creak. And she can imagine the couch where it always used to sit. But now the couch has been relocated to one of the siblings, trying to make room for the next person that would come inhabit this home. Joanne removes old family photos from the walls, carrying memories that she now grieves, all to make space for the stranger. This place is both familiar and unfamiliar at exactly the same time. Because memory keeps insisting, this is home, but reality keeps answering, not really in the same way anymore. I think there are seasons of life that can feel like this, that maybe we're standing on familiar earth, but we're a little disoriented, no longer quite understanding where we are. Maybe a relationship that was important to you changed, or maybe the work that you thought was going to bring meaning leaves you exhausted instead. Maybe your children grow up and leave the shape of your family completely different, or maybe you discover something about yourself that makes the life that you had planned no longer really fit. Or maybe your faith changes. Things that we once believed with confidence can easily become more complicated. Questions that we thought we had settled can reopen. The language that we use for God doesn't always stay the same. And suddenly we find ourselves saying with the disciples, I had hoped. I had hoped this would turn out differently or that I would know by now. I hoped that I would feel differently or that God would do something. I hoped that I knew where my life was going. I hoped. Those words can feel frightening because sometimes I think we want our faith to make us certain about what comes next. We may want faith to give us a firm ground to stand on. And when it feels like the ground is shifting, we can maybe start wondering if we're doing faith wrong. And so maybe we rush towards meaning, trying to explain the loss or find the lesson behind the grief. We try to get ourselves to Easter before we fully processed the Friday. But the earth doesn't work that way. These disciples and we cannot hurry across a 7-mile divide, friends. You can't simply wish yourself into another destination. Sorry, Star Trek. You still have to cross that ground here and there. One foot, then another, continuing down the road. John O'Donohue writes beautifully about the earth being a keeper of memory. John writes that the earth receives what happens upon it, and so generation after generation continues to walk along the same ground. Joy happens on this ground. Grief happens on this ground. People arrive, people leave, buildings arise, buildings leave, and underneath it all, the earth remains. O'Donohue says that even though we often fail to notice it, the earth is always faithfully there. I love this imagery because when everything else feels like it's shifting, sometimes faith doesn't look like having an answer. Sometimes faith looks like finding enough ground to take another step. And so that's where the grace of this Emmaus story comes to emerge. The grace begins on the road. Because while Cleopas and his companion are saying, we had hoped, Jesus is already walking there beside them. Before they understand, before their sadness lifts, before they had come to believe the story of the women that Jesus is alive. Before they even recognize him, Jesus is there, walking along the same earth, matching their pace and listening. I find it remarkable that Jesus doesn't immediately identify himself. He could have. Jesus could have interrupted Cleopas halfway through and said, actually, surprise, good news. But Jesus doesn't do that. Instead, Jesus helps them to see what happens in the larger story, one beyond what they can currently imagine. And still, after all this, they still don't recognize Jesus. They keep walking. Jesus keeps walking. Their feet keep touching the earth. They're spilling the tea step after step. Eventually, they reach Emmaus. And night is approaching quickly. And so Jesus appears ready to continue on. And in true hospitality, they say, no, stay with us. And so Jesus stays with them. And they sit down to eat. And the disciples invite Jesus into their house as a guest. But then Jesus takes that bread, blesses it, and gives it to them. And this clicks. They've seen this before. Their bodies remember. Their memories begin to connect a meal, a table, bread in the hands of Jesus. And that's when Luke tells us that their eyes were opened and they recognized Jesus. And so I wonder if this recognition happens precisely because Jesus gives them something familiar enough to remember. The memories that had been causing them pain as they walked along the road had now become a part of their recognition of Jesus. The path that they had taken was not erased, but it's seen in a different light. And so suddenly they realized that this stranger was Jesus all along, that Jesus was the one who had listened to them. Jesus was the one who was there when they said, "We had hoped." Jesus was the one who walked beside them when they had no idea what was going on. And so I wonder, friends, if you've ever asked yourself, if you've looked past on a season and you've wondered where God was, or if someone was holding you in the midst of that challenging time, my friends, this is where grace comes in. That is the grace that we practice in this space among each other. In this space, we have friends who pray for each other, even when you may struggle to pray for yourself. Hope may feel lost to you in this moment, and yet in this space, this is a place where we hold hope for each other. Oftentimes we talk about how we can learn a lot from the earth. And so the lesson for today is perhaps consider the earth, but after a fire has gone through. From the surface in this forest, it can look like nothing but devastation. Blackened tree trunks, ash coating the ground, and a landscape that seems to have lost everything that it once had. And then eventually, after time, something tiny begins to push through the earth. Not because the fire wasn't devastating, and not because the fire or the forest simply goes back to the way that it was before the fire, because it doesn't. The landscape carries that memory and the imagery of fire, and yet beneath that burned ground, life is beginning to do things that we cannot yet see. The roots remain, the seeds are spreading and opening, and the nutrients are returning to the soil. The color green starts to take over the black earth. The ground holds both things. It holds what was lost, and it holds what is becoming. And so, friends, may our lives look like that. May we carry those memories, those scars, those disappointments, those lost hopes. May we carry the things that we hoped would happen and didn't. Grace doesn't require us to erase any of that. Instead, we believe that Jesus Christ meets us on that ground. And that's perhaps why the earth is such a fitting place for us to end our sermon series together. And so 4 weeks ago, we started with fire. We learned with Moses that God was already there, that Moses simply turned aside to look. Then we went to the water, and we learned that when the disciples lowered their net once again to catch fish, Jesus was already on the shore preparing a meal for them and inviting them to cast again. And then last week, we entered a locked room, and we breathed. And we were reminded that Jesus Christ was already there breathing life into those disciples. They simply received. And so today, we have the earth. We have 2 disciples, 2 grieving people. We have dusty feet. We have bread on the table. And we read that Jesus is already walking, step by step. The disciples simply come to recognize him. And so again and again, the invitation for us is to not make God appear. It is instead to notice the God who is already there, to turn aside, to cast again, to breathe in, to walk on. Maybe today you don't need to know where you're going. You don't need to know where the road ends or to understand the landscape of the season that you're in as much as you may want to, and I do too. because the ground doesn't demand that you know these things. The ground doesn't demand that we declare our journey. We simply take each step as it comes. And so may faith today not look like certainty, unless that is what you need today, but maybe it's more simple. Maybe it's putting one foot down and then the other, trusting that the earth will hold you gently and trusting that God can meet you there. And may we pay attention to the companions along the side of the road and the memories that surface, because perhaps one day you'll look back on the road that you're traveling right now, the part that you don't see right now or recognize, and you'll notice that God was there with you walking through it. I hope this is enough to encourage you to keep walking. The earth beneath us, Jesus beside us, all the while walking on. Thanks be to God. Let's pray together. God, who walks before us and beside us, we ask that you meet us on the roads that we understand and the roads that we don't. And when the ground beneath us feels uncertain, give us enough trust to take the next step. God, open our eyes to your presence in the earth beneath our feet, in the people beside us, and in the ordinary moments that we might otherwise miss. And when we look back, help us to recognize the ways that you have been with us all along. Amen.